It's really good to be here with you all today. And thank you for paying attention to this conversation, to what it is that God is stirring up inside of you in your ministry context. This is good stuff. This is the kind of conversation I love to be a part of. Katie, is it possible that I can share my screen? Am I all set up now? I think so. I'm going to click on this and share something with you all. I wanted to talk with you a little bit about this passage that comes out of Joel and Acts for us this morning. As you probably read this passage before, and it says this: I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men and women will see visions. Like I said, this is a passage that we see both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian Testament. And I want to use this as kind of like our mantra for this hour this morning that we spend together. And so before we go any further, I would just simply want to ask you the question, what are you dreaming? What are you dreaming for this morning? What are you aspiring towards? What do you long for? Why don't we just take a moment and write that down somewhere? Maybe put it into your phone. Just type it out into your notes app on your phone or on paper that's in front of you or on a program on your laptop. Just put down someplace. What is it that you are dreaming for, longing for this morning? And the reason why I asked you to write this down is so that you can hopefully keep this in front of you as we continue our conversation this morning. Our dreams and our visions as it relates to this work of starting new communities says something about what we imagine, about what we imagine for the future, what we are hoping for. It says something about outcomes. And outcomes are what we want to talk about today. Dreams are nothing less than our desired outcomes. They are our aspirations, goals that frequently do not have metrics attached to them, but they nonetheless are a goal. And metrics are attached to a lot of the work of church, right? We count baptisms, we count confirmations, we count weddings, we count funerals, worship attendance, Sunday school attendance, and these days, visits to our web properties. But my question is, what are we measuring for? Why do these metrics matter? There's a popular saying that goes like this: your system is perfectly designed to get your current results. So if we are hoping for a different outcome than we currently experience, we may want to think a bit different about our metrics and how they relate to our dreams and visions, our goals, and our desired outcomes, right? So how do we get to a different kind of dream than our current results? How do we get to a different kind of result? Well, I wanted to think a moment about this famous line that we've probably all heard our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, say at different times in different places in writings and in sermons and speeches and public statements of different kinds. We will not give up until this world reflects less of our nightmare and more of God's dream. And Bishop Curry has often said this, and it's a wonderful dream statement as it demonstrates where one is and where they are headed. And at first blush, it looks like a difficult metric, but we will certainly know if we're close to reaching this particular goal. In that sense, it is more of a distance traveled than it's a destination potentially. And so with that in mind, I want to think a little bit with you about the difference between counting and measuring when it comes to getting towards our desired outcomes, our vision and our dreams. So let me use just a brief example for you or an analogy to help us think about the difference between counting and measuring and their relationship to our goals. I recently, as Katie just pointed out, moved from Texas to San Diego. And so on the last day before our move, as we had just finished loading the moving trucks that would take our stuff from Texas to California, we then proceeded to plan out our trip for our family, our 3 kids, our cat and our dog, and the luggage that we would need to live out of our suitcases for the next month as we waited to get to our permanent home in San Diego. We had to load all those things up into our car and get on the road. And there was one point in our trip across country where we had this conversation about, Dad, you don't require a lot of sleep. Could we get to our destination a little faster if you were willing to maybe just drive through the last night? Everybody was so excited to get to California, see their grandparents and everything. And so there was a few things that went into the planning of that trip. It wasn't just about getting to the destination. It was about figuring out what all needed to go into getting into our destination. How much gas did we need to get there? How many days would it take to get there? Making sure we didn't leave any children behind. And we had enough luggage to last us not only the road trip, but the month in between, getting from one home to the next home and all of those things in between. In other words, there's the distance traveled, there's the measuring of a distance, but then there's counting the various activities and resources that have to go into getting from one place to another. And so when it comes to starting new communities, one of the most important things we need to do is to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is God longing for in this place? What is it that vision that God has put into our hearts? What is the thing that we dream of in our particular context? And then beginning to determine, well, what do we need to actually get there? So that leads me to the work of a particular Christian author, Gil Rendle, that I want to just talk a little bit about. Gil Rendle wrote this short little book called Doing the Math of Mission. And in this book, Gil talks about the difference between counting and measuring. And he draws on the work of this particular person. This is Dr. Deming, who was someone that looked at systems in the middle part of the 20th century, and has actually been attributed to one of the people that helped modernize the economy in post-World War II Japan. And what Gil Rendle draws on, and he pulls from Deming's work, is thinking about outcomes and its relationship to the pieces of work that we have to do in order to get to those outcomes. And a few moments ago, I just asked you what your dream is. What is that vision? What is that desired outcome that you long for in the work that you are being called towards? And what Deming and Rendle point out is that we need to be clear on what are the inputs. In other words, as Deming puts it, what are the resources we need to actually get to the vision that we have? And he refers to these as nouns. So these would be things like, you're going to need people on your team, right? You're going to need certain people because you are just one individual with certain gifts, and you're going to need other gifts to contribute towards the vision that that has been put on your heart. These particular resources oftentimes end up being the kinds of things that Christian leaders tend to count. So we'll talk about butts and pews and budgets. We talk about the people, the volunteers that we need, the people that attend our worship services. We talk about money. These are the assets, the things that we need to do ministry, the things that are required to get to where we are headed. But then Rendle and Deming point out that there are also throughputs. In other words, there are certain activities that we need those resources to contribute towards that get us to our desired outcomes. Now, I pointed out that truism a few moments ago, that our current systems are perfectly designed to get our current results. And we count certain things in our Episcopal systems, and we have certain activities that we say are normative, and they lead to particular results. If we have a different desired outcome, then it's important for us to take a step back and look at the things that actually are required to get to the desired outcome that we hope for. So, for example, when my kids pushed me on this idea of shortening the distance that we could travel, I had to really think about things. If we could press through the night in order to get to California earlier, did I have enough gas? How many times would I need to stop and get gas? Did I have enough snacks to kind of keep me, and coffee to keep me going through the night so I could get to where I was going? But in every time that we are aspiring to a new goal, it's important that we actually start with where it is that we dream of going, and then work backwards, reverse engineer our process, and ask ourselves, what are the various activities and resources required to get there? This whole process is, in a sense, kind of like the work of a scientist, maybe not exactly a scientist, maybe more a little bit like a mad scientist. But in the scientific methodology, what we do is we start with a hypothesis. We don't go into this work of starting new Christian communities with a completely clear vision of how or what it's going to exactly look like. We work off of some hunches and ideas. They aren't necessarily always perfectly defined, but we have a stirring, we have a vision, an imagination for what it is that we think God is doing. In other words, we have a hypothesis of what we think it is that God is doing. And what any good scientist will tell you is that once you have your hypothesis, you need to go about testing out that idea. You need to figure out what resources and activities you need to do in order to test out whether or not that hunch is correct, that hypothesis is accurate. And in going about the work of sussing out a vision and a dream for what new Christian community might look like, it's not all that different. It requires some of the same things, where we need to think about the kind of the inputs and throughputs we need so that we can go about testing out the idea that God has placed on our hearts. And so what we want to do this morning is to kind of test this out a bit, is to spend some time actually thinking about, well, what is our dream? What is it that God has placed on our hearts? The kind of vision for Christian community that is not, but could be. And then think about, well, what are the things that are required to help us get there? That's how we get to the kinds of goals that are going to help us test out what it is that God has placed on our hearts. So we're going to break out into some groups to actually wrestle with these ideas in conversation here in a moment. But let me just stop here and see if there are any questions or comments that we want to make at the moment. Any questions for clarity on this?
Jason, I just put this in the chat box, but you're reminding me of some conversations I had last night with clergy who feel a lot of shame that they're not offering the normative programs that their sister churches have had, or at least before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But then they were also saying, yeah, but what programs, but none of those programs have anything to do with the outcomes and the longings that I have for my community. So there's this tension, right, between what we think is expected of us and actually living into that deep longing.
Yeah, we tend to look at the inputs oftentimes as if that is the end goal. So we'll say, well, gosh, how many people participated and how much money did they give? And that somehow determines whether or not it's success. But my argument would be that's only part of the equation. The most important thing we need to begin with is to ask ourselves, well, why would those be important in the first place? What do they actually accomplish? What is different in the world? What is the outcome because we actually participate, we had those types of inputs? And then the next question in relation to that is the throughput question, right? Like, so what if so many people showed up to a certain thing or gave a certain amount? What was it towards? And do those actually contribute to any kind of change in our context? Do they contribute to what we long for? Do they move us in the direction that we are hoping to go? So as far as these different ways of counting and measuring, we can count these quantitative things. We can count how many people participate. We can count how much money people give. We also can count how many activities we've done, how many worship services we've held, how many Sunday school classes, et cetera, how many small groups we have. But to what end? What do they change in the world? And that's more qualitative. It's a little bit squishier. I recognize that. But that's what dreams and visions are all about. Dreams and visions are something that we can't necessarily count, but we can measure how close we're getting to that thing that we aspire towards. Just like my journey with my family across country. I could count how many people were in the car, whether or not we had the dog or cat in the car with us, whether we had enough luggage. I could count how much gas I had in the tank, but I was measuring the distance between where we were and where we were going. We need to have the reason why we test out these ideas, the reason why we approach it almost like a scientific hypothesis is because we're trying to test out the distance between what God is longing for in the world around us, as Bishop Curry often says, and whether or not we're getting any closer to that. What are those things? How can we measure how close we're getting to what it is that we dream of?